This next challenge also comes in two parts, the first of which is significantly easier than the second. In both cases, we're dealing with this stacked data table that we receive each month on the left-hand side, and it represents a list of contacts as part of a sales initiative. Now, ideally, we want the data so that each contact takes up one row of our spreadsheet. That way we can track status and all sorts of other things in that row. So the challenge is, how do you recreate that layout? You'll also need to think about how you extract the email provider, that's the part after the @ in the email address, from each person's email. The challenge on the harder task is that you don't have the ID on the input table. Now, in this case, you can assume that when a name, a phone number, and an email appear one under each other, that they belong to the same person. But you're going to have to be a bit more creative in how you come up with the solution and the output on the right-hand side. Have a go at both of these before you look at my solutions. Let's take a look at how to solve the stacked data problem, and we'll start with the easier version. So again, we click on the table, get data from table or range. I'll rename this to 2A answer. And what I really want is for this field column to appear along the top of my table. Now, when we change the layout from vertical to horizontal, or the other way around, what we're referring to is pivoting and unpivoting. So click the field column, transform, and then hit pivot column. Now, in each of those new columns, name, phone number, and email, the entry I want to see is simply what's in this value column. So the value column needs to be value. Now, these are text strings, so I really don't need any aggregation at all, so don't aggregate. So looking back to that previous step there, each of the fields column entries become column headers over here, name, phone number, and email. Each of the values that we see here become entries in those columns. And Power Query knows that these three entries belong together because they have the same ID. And therefore, when we pivot our data, those remain together in the ID1 row. This will prove to be the bigger challenge when we move to the harder version in a second. Before we move on, we also need to extract the email provider out of these email addresses. So the way I'm going to do that is click on the email column, transform that, and we're going to extract the text between two delimiters. The two delimiters I'm going to use are the @ symbol, which always appears just before the email provider. And in this case, I'm going to keep it simple and just use .com as the end delimiter. Let's see if that works for a second before we discuss that in more detail. So it seemed to work, but consider what might happen if those email addresses maybe ended in .co.uk or .fr from France or any other variation. So it might be safer for us to future-proof our query by using simply a full stop to define the end of the email provider. Then it really doesn't matter what appears next. We just extract the information we need. Finally, let's make sure the column is called exactly what it is. So instead of email, it is now called email provider. So let's quickly load that to the worksheet before importing the harder version of the same problem. So in the second problem, we have exactly the same table, but this time we don't have those IDs to tell Power Query that these stacked entries belong together. Let's pull the data in and see what we can do with it. So really the only piece of information I'm missing here is that ID column. I need to somehow recreate a unique ID for each of these people. We know that this ID is gradually going to increase as we go through our table. So maybe a similar sounding concept and a good place to start in this case is by introducing an index column. And we'll introduce an index column from 0, and you'll see why later on. So that's progress, but I need the first 3 rows to all have the same index, and then the next 3 rows to have the same, and the increment to work that way around. And so we need some kind of mathematical rule that is going to transform these index values into 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 222, and so on. So here's where we can be a bit creative. Let's use some standard math and use divide integer. We're going to divide all of the values in this column by 3. In particular, the integer divide function will tell us only how many times the value 3 goes into our index, and it will remove the remainder. And sure enough, we have 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, and so on. Just to show you what's going on there, suppose instead we had used the standard divide function and we just divided by 3. Instead, we'd get the full detail of that division, including the decimal remainder. All I want is that first value, the integer, and so you can see that is 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, and so on. I'm going to remove that step because all we need is the integer division. Now, I mentioned that we specifically used an index from 0. What would have happened if we'd used an index from 1? Let's hit Settings on Index and change the starting index to 1. Instead, when we click on the next step, our division is slightly out of line with the entries in our table. We only have 2 for the first one, followed by 3, 3, and so on. So it's important in this case that our index starts from 0. And so really, once we have this new column and we remove the index column, the task becomes the same as before. We can click on the field column, hit pivot column, and apply the same settings as before. So you can see already that when you're using Power Query, you have to start being creative with how you come up with these solutions to transform your data.